Hello, and welcome back to the Going Off Track podcast. I am Kathryn, and it is finally time to talk race predictions. It feels like it has been a million years since the end of last season, and it also feels like preseason went by in a flash, which is hilarious because this was one of the longer preseasons we've ever had, and so many things happened. But this race is probably going to be a hot mess. I titled the episode Mulligan in Melbourne because I think as you'll see as we get to the end of the episode, I'm pretty sure a lot of teams are going to take this one as like let's pretend that never happened. But for more on why we'll get there. First things first, Emily was intending on being in today's episode, but is still stuck at work. And yes, she has still been stuck at work for the last 4 months. We hope that one day she'll be able to come home soon. Hopefully that will be on Sunday for our race reaction. But before we get into the Australia of it all, let's get into some news first. First things first, I am repping the team they told you not to worry about t-shirt. And in the grand history of co-hosts wearing oversized t-shirts, this is quite large on me. This was a holiday gift from my sisters. There's the shirt in full here from Visa Cash App Racing Bulls that they got for me, and I just still think it is funny and hope that Racing Bulls will be good this year. Obviously, they have Liam Lawson and a rookie, so they basically still have 2 rookies, so we will see how they go, but they are like nowhere on the list of teams of great concern and note, as you will soon see. But first things first, I am recording this it is Thursday. Obviously, we have free practice in about, as I am recording, in about 8 hours. So know that you'll be able to listen to this as you get ready to dive into the season. But first things, the F1 title sequence dropped this morning, and I watched it a couple times. It looks pretty good. I think I like it better than last year's. I was looking primarily for the memes in the title sequence, or what is going to be used as a meme. I picked out a couple. There's one of Lance Stroll looking very smug, which is hilarious because he's definitely not going to beat his teammate for the millionth consecutive time in his career, which, if you don't already know, Lance Stroll has never once beat his teammate in a head-to-head competition in the entirety of his career. So that was that. The other one is like, why is Carlos so far away that you could barely see him? And what is Kimi doing? Like, in the grand tradition of Mercedes drivers just turning the intro video into memes, we have it again. It's not George this time, though I think George tried, but I think that his bit in the opening sequence is very not the T-pose anymore, which is great that he's not trying to replicate it for a third time, because we know that it didn't really work last time and really only worked the first time. And then there's Lando with his, finger, because he's number 1, which I'll get to my thoughts on that in a minute. The other thing that we have is we actually do have some pretty significant schedule concerns, which will have a significant impact, especially if these races cannot be run. Obviously, the last time we had a race that was canceled was Emilia-Romagna in Imola a couple of years ago, right after there were these massive floods, so they couldn't run the race there because they literally couldn't get people in. Right now, the Bahrain Grand Prix and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix are both at risk because of everything that's going on in the Middle East, which we're not going to dive into here, but it is a problem. We already know that F1 teams over the last week have had trouble getting their team members out of Bahrain following testing. So that was one of those like down to the wire things. It seems at this point that everybody who needed to have gotten out has gotten out, which is good. They F1 has curfews for setup. They kind of adjusted the rules a little bit on that based on what's going on in the world. But right now, rounds 4 and 5 on the schedule, race days are April 12th and April 19th. Those are currently, up in the air. It hasn't really been mentioned that in any, official capacity. Obviously, we had a little incident at, I think, an oil refinery near the track in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that was last year. I think that was a couple years ago. Middle East, that we all know that I have thoughts about F1 racing in the Middle East. Let's just leave it at that. But that is something to keep note of, is that these races, we might not see them happen, and we might have a spring break along with our summer break and the summer shutdown. So those are things to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're getting into F1 this season, or if you kind of forgot that this is happening, F1 in the United States has moved its broadcast from the ESPN family of networks to Apple TV. So if you are looking for F1 this weekend, know that you're not going to find it on, if you still have cable or on the ESPN app, you're going to have to go to Apple TV. I believe, and I haven't tried this yet because I'm just kind of avoiding it, that you can log into F1 TV with your Apple TV account and you will still be able to access everything on F1 TV. I'm going to have to actually do that at some point if I'm ever going to fulfill my promise of watching every race of the 2010 season, which I swear I am still going to do. I promise it'll happen eventually. But know that it's going to be on Apple TV. Stefano Domenicali is still trying to insist that this is going to be a good move for growth of Formula One in the United States. I do not believe him for a second, and I don't think you should either. Prove me wrong, Stefano. But the thing about moving to a private streaming service like Apple TV is that unlike ESPN and other, broadcast cable networks, which have a broader ability for people to access, especially in the United States, is that they also share their viewership numbers. We've seen that especially with the growth of, going off track here a little bit, but like the growth of women's sports, and specifically this past season of the collegiate volleyball season, they showed pretty much every step of the way of the postseason of all those ESPN broadcasts, what those numbers were. Apple TV is not going to do that. And so we are never going to be able to compare what numbers we're going to get in the United States specifically, which is a current target for F1 growth. We're never going to see a comparison of year over year between ESPN and Apple TV and, what the drop off is. There is going to be a significant drop off. I don't know what Apple TV's membership numbers are. I have Apple TV. I watched Ted Lasso. I watched the F1 movie when it drops, and had the exact same thoughts when I was watching the F1 movie in theaters both times, which our thoughts on the F1 movie are linked above. But we're never going to see those numbers, but I don't think that they are ever actually going to meet, let alone surpass, the ESPN numbers. I just don't think it's possible. There are so many streaming services out here now that it's kind of defeating the purpose of letting go of cable, which I have not done because I watch too many sports on too many different platforms, and they're trying to make a unified, sports broadcast streaming service, but I'll believe it when I see it. So I have some major concerns that, there's going to be a stall in growth in F1 broadcast viewership in the United States. They've done such great work over the last few years with the ESPN contract. And obviously ESPN isn't exactly financially stable, which is why they didn't want to pay $1 billion for an extended contract with F1. So I get that ESPN had its own reasons for not extending the contract, and that there are only so many sports broadcast options in the United States that they kind of had to go private. If you don't go ESPN, you have to go private because Fox Sports is already at capacity with NASCAR and IndyCar and MotoGP, and being Fox Sports, not my favorite. But anyway, the whole point is that this is going to be very interesting to keep an eye on. But also, if you don't have Apple TV, either A, get Apple TV, or B, find a friend that has Apple TV and go watch with them. And if they're not already an F1 fan, you can make them an F1 fan by making them sit through the international flying circus that is Formula One. And now, speaking of F1 broadcasts, obviously Apple TV is just taking over, or not taking over, but they are broadcasting the Sky Sports F1 broadcast from the UK. And very interestingly, when Sky Sports announced their presenters for the 2026 season, they did not include one specific name that is very relevant to American sport, which is Danica Patrick. So Danica Patrick, it doesn't look like she is currently on the coverage announcement for the season. It looks like Jenson Button is going to be expanding his responsibilities with Sky Sports F1, along with his responsibilities as being, he was just announced a couple months ago as an Aston Martin ambassador. But we're not going to see Danica Patrick in her weird outfits and her weird opinions, and that's so sad. except it's not. But anyway, moving on to Australia. We are finally in Australia. We are back. Australia last year was kind of wild for a lot of reasons. It was a wet weather race and it was just kind of insane. Obviously, we had, from the start, from the formation lap, we had the really unfortunate Isaac Hadjar crash on the formation lap for his rookie race, and he was just very upset. So we had that really great moment between him and Anthony Hamilton, Lewis Hamilton's father, which we go into a little bit more about why that was great in our reaction episode from last season, so you can check that in the card above. But that was one of the highlight moments, which also did make it into Drive to Survive. I'm working my way through Drive to Survive. I am not as worried about finishing Drive to Survive as we have typically done the last couple of years. But if you've seen it, you know that they kind of brushed over that. But anyway, it was a great moment. It was also Oscar Piastri almost became the first Australian driver to podium at his home race, but blew it, and we didn't really know that was foreshadowing what was going to happen toward the end of the season, but surprise, it did. That race also had 6 DNFs, all of the rookies except for Ollie Behrman and Kimi Antonelli, who finished a very impressive 4th, but also rookie Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz, who did not have a great start to his season with Williams, but that did ultimately improve. Australia was an exciting race. We are not going to get that level of excitement from the weather, at the very least, from Australia. Right now, there's only a 10% chance of rain on Sunday, so I don't think that we're really going to see that. We're going to see that in other ways, because this is a brand new season, new regulation, tons of new rules. We should probably do like a deep dive into the rules at some point within the next week or two, so I'll put that on my list. But among other things, there's a whole new start procedure. So from getting the car turned on to actually starting the race is a whole new different procedure that the teams have to do and go through. And there has been some talk in the testing periods about adjusting that. And then one team saying, but it's fine, so we don't want it to be changed. It's been a whole thing. And then, of course, spoiler alert, it was not fine. It was Ferrari. They became a meme, which Ferrari will, of course, continue to meme themselves as the season goes on. But that's a whole other story. And to my friend Danielle, if you are listening to this, I am sorry that I'm maligning Lewis Hamilton's team. I will continue to do so week in, week out, because they give us reason to. And I am sorry. And congratulations. But we have new power unit manufacturers on the grid this year. First, we have Red Bull Ford is finally making its debut. They announced a couple of years ago that they were going to be making their own power units in-house. They did that with Honda, with Red Bull powertrains. Now it is just Red Bull Ford, now that Honda has moved over to Aston Martin. The Audi hybrid power unit will also be making its debut this season with the Audi F1 team as they make their debut. I'll get to them in a minute. And Alpine is moving from the poor now previous Renault, which is no longer a thing in Formula One because they were bad, and is now going to be a Mercedes customer team. This might mean that Alpine will have better performances because the Mercedes power unit looks very, very good going into the season. But of course, it's also Alpine, so probably not going to go over very well because it's not just the car, it's who you put in the car, and Pierre Gasly can only do so much. But most importantly, Cadillac is finally making its debut. The Cadillac Totally Not Andretti Formula One team, which, if you've watched my Cadillac primer, is why I call them that. But more reasons why this is the Totally Not Andretti Cadillac Formula One team is they literally named the chassis after Mario Andretti. So it is called the Mac 26, the Mario Andretti Cadillac 2026. So the more they insist that Andretti has nothing to do with this from a managerial operational standpoint, the more I sit back here and laugh. As we know, Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas are back on the grid after their respective years off. But most interestingly, the talk over the last many months has been there was a change recently in the regulations on drivers with penalties and whether they have to serve their penalties or not when they return to the grid based on how much time. And they changed the rules saying that if they initially said if a driver is given a penalty within the last 12 months and hasn't served it yet, then they will not have to serve that penalty. So at first everyone's like, oh, so this means that when Valtteri Bottas comes back to the grid, he won't have to serve it. Then they further clarified that because that rule came into effect after his penalty, which was in 2024, that he would not, that he would still have to serve it because the penalty was applied to him prior to the rules change. Well, then today or yesterday, Bottas is like, no, I don't have to serve it because the penalty was given out more than 12 months ago. So currently, the regulation, which is Article B2.5.4 of the latest sporting regulations, says classified drivers who have 15 or less cumulative unserved grid penalties for the race imposed in the previous 12 months will be allocated a temporary grid position equal to their qualifying session classification plus the sum of their unserved grid penalties. As Bottas's penalty was issued before the 12-month time limit, he will not have to serve that previous imposed penalty. What that means is ultimately word salad, but primarily it means that Bottas, we have gone back and forth of whether he is going to have to serve this penalty or not. Ultimately, he is not going to have to. Do I understand why? No, not really. Did that reading from the regulations article make a lot of sense? No. But shit happens. So he will not serve a 5-place grid penalty. And I think they probably just were strongly encouraged because it makes a better marketing spectacle for him to be on the grid wherever he qualifies. And obviously Cadillac wants them to qualify. Both drivers want to qualify as high up the grid as possible. Oof, boy. Now, speaking of penalties, let's get an update on penalty points. As we know, when drivers crash into each other, do something stupid on track, they have they will be given, penalties in race, 5-second, 10-second penalties, but they also get points applied to their super licenses. And if you get 12 points, you get a race ban. The last time we had a race ban, the only time that we've had a race ban in a very long time, was Kevin Magnussen in 2024 for Baku. He was replaced by Ollie Behrman. He currently leads the charge of drivers with the most penalty points. He has 10 of 12. So he needs to be very, very careful until those points start coming off of his license. If you don't remember or you don't know, when you get a penalty, that those points, so if you get 2 penalties in Australia 2025, those points will not come off until the date a year later. So if it was March 5th, 2025, they will stay on until March 5th, 2026. So I don't remember exactly when Ollie's first points start falling off, but until then, he has to be very, very careful. And he was the most penalty prone last season, mostly just because he would just make little oopsies. One of them was for speeding in the pit lane under red flag conditions. So these are obviously things that can be minimized. It's not like he's playing rock and sock and robots on track like Kevin Magnussen used to. So that is something to keep note of, is that Ollie has to drive very, very clean for a while. Then following him, there's a lot more breathing room. Everyone else has half the amount or less. Liam Lawson and Lance Stroll both have 6 points. Kimi Antonelli has 5 points. Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz both have 4 points. Alex Albon, Lewis Hamilton, and Max Verstappen have 3 points each. Gabriel Bortoleto and Pierre Gasly have 2 points. Franco Colapinto, Charles Leclerc, and Esteban Ocon have 1 point each, and Lando, George, Isaac, Fernando, Nico, Arvid Lindblad, obviously, Valtteri, and Sergio Perez all have 0 points and especially Arvid because he's never driven in Formula One before. Speaking of debuts, obviously Audi will also be making their debut as a works team alongside Cadillac. They are taking over for our friends at Sauber, known as Steak, Kick, etc., in their weird looking livery that I still don't like, and I have all of my thoughts on our liveries. That'll be down in the description, but I had a lot of opinions and the Cadillac is still beautiful. But anyway, to give us a benchmark for our new constructors, I think this really more applies to Cadillac than it does Audi, mostly because Audi's basically just Sauber in a different hat, even though it's like a completely new team with a completely new power unit, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the last time we had a new constructor make their debut, as you know, was in Australia in 2016 with Haas when they showed up on the grid for the first time. The result of that race, Esteban Gutierrez, who did not score any points for Haas in his career, he DNF'd on lap 16. But Romain Grosjean, he finished P6, so he scored 8 points. And I don't want to call it like if Audi and Cadillac don't score 8 points, that will be a bad debut for both teams. I think that obviously the goal is points for both teams. I think that as I said in the Cadillac primer, Cadillac is in a much better position than most new constructors on the grid going back the last 25 years because they have two drivers with more experience than all of the rookie drivers coming from a new constructor, combined. It's actually kind of ridiculous how much experience they have in comparison. Like I said, that's in the primer. But I think that Cadillac hasn't really been, lighting up the timing sheets. We'll see how they do tonight going into the first free practices. But I do think that they do have an opportunity to outpace Haas. Obviously, Haas had a great start and then kind of didn't do much else. So they, yes, this might be a mulligan in some ways for the teams. Yes, that, Cadillac has a good chance to have a strong start. Obviously, Cadillac compared to Audi is going to be, they're currently using a Ferrari power unit. So at least we hope that the Ferrari power unit is good, which we also know that Ferrari is going to Ferrari themselves, but we also know that Ferrari customer teams tend to perform better than Ferrari themselves, which is just weird, but whatever. So it's going to be really interesting to see how both of these teams debut. I do fully expect to see a stronger debut out of Cadillac, even though both drivers haven't driven for a year. I have a feeling that they're going to outperform Audi a little bit, but I do think that I think that they're going to be the each other's greatest competition this season, which I think we'll see that not after this race, but probably after race 2, maybe not even until after race 4 or 5, which considering races 4 or 5 might be canceled. Races, it might take a while to see what the pecking order is going to look like. But what we do know in the pecking order is that Aston Martin is probably going to be not just in dead last, but like so dead last. They're like at the previous race while everyone is like a race ahead of them. Like it's really bad at Aston Martin right now. Like it has been so bad that the team has spent this week basically preemptively warning the world about how bad they're going to be. We have seen since testing and since that last day of testing where they were only able to go 6 laps because of their power unit issue, that they have been preemptively warning that A, they're going to be bad, and B, that they're not going to finish the race. And among other things, they are dealing with a serious vibration issue in the power unit that is not just an issue of like, it's a problem for the car, but it is a problem that they don't want to give the drivers actual nerve damage. They have said that based on what the drivers have been saying and what they've been talking about with the team, that legitimately Fernando Alonso can only go 25 laps without his hands falling off, and Lance Stroll has said that he can only go 15, which really goes to show you just how much better Fernando is than his teammate, and that the best thing Aston Martin can ever do for themselves is move on from Lance Stroll. But who's really going to tell Daddy Stroll that to his face is obviously the big question. And of course, the answer is Yuki Tsunoda is still available. But the point is right now Aston Martin is trying to figure out, because it's not just like, oh, it's a power unit issue. That means the chassis is fine. If the power unit is going to like make the mirrors fly off the chassis, that's kind of a problem and kind of unsafe. So what we're probably going to see is Aston Martin is going to be very limited in the free practices. They're going to be, I don't know if they're going to be limited in qualifying, but they're not going to be fast in qualifying, and they're not going to finish the race. But what they do need is they do need to see how the car is in a racing capacity. They haven't done a race run in testing yet. Obviously we haven't had practices yet, because as you're listening to this, it's 10:45 in the morning in Arizona. So they haven't started practices in Melbourne, but they need to balance needing to see the car in a racing capacity versus literally not breaking Fernando Alonso's hands off. So that's not going to be a good thing at all. And Aston Martin is honestly, I think the first third of the season might just be a wash for them. And I think that Aston Martin can very well go from having like one of the greatest disaster starts to one of the greatest finishes we've ever seen. But I don't really know about that. That might be a little too optimistic for them. We'll see. Shrug. The other thing that we're going to see is how McLaren is going to be applying Papaya rules, which, as we know, are something that I hate. And Papaya rules are basically that they are treating both their drivers as their number one driver, when we all know that their number one driver in their hearts and minds is Lando Norris, the current reigning champion, because they did everything to serve Lando the championship on a silver platter while throwing Oscar Piastri under the bus. And they can say until the cows come home that they're treating their drivers equally, which we all know that they're not. But they currently have a reigning world champion. Not, they have an obligation, especially because it's Lando and how much they love Lando more than they love Oscar, to support Lando on his quest for a second world championship that I do not think he is going to get. Like, I just think that competition wise, I think that I don't want to say George is a favorite, even though that's what the numbers guys are saying, because I am still on team Max Verstappen finally getting his fifth. But I am saying that no matter what McLaren says about treating both drivers equally, they have a current reigning champion. So they are going to have to do everything that they can to maintain Lando in his position, even if Oscar is doing better. So this is going to get really annoying. It is probably going to be a disaster, and we are probably going to see Oscar move to Ferrari in the next couple of years. But anyway, we'll see about that. The other thing to note is that the Williams is overweight. And I'm putting this in here really quick because we love Williams here on the Going Off Track podcast, and we want to see Williams do well. Alex Albon has confirmed that the car is heavy, which we know that when the car is overweight, you have a minimum weight that you have to be, and you cannot be below that weight. We have seen teams, George Russell, get disqualified for the car being underweight, which is a combination of both car and driver. And the car can be over the weight by any capacity, but the heavier the car is, the slower it's going to be. So right now, we know that the Williams is going to be slow. We know that's going to impact performance and pace early on this season, and the team priority is for the car to go on a diet, so to speak. And he said this week that he predicts to see them in the bottom half of the midfield as the team focuses on optimizing everything, which is like, it's kind of disappointing when you think about Williams and where we want to see Williams. But we also know that Williams last year exceeded expectations to the extreme after having a very difficult start and also kind of a difficult finish. But they got 2 podiums out of Carlos for the first time in forever. They outpaced their performances by at least a decade with their finish last year. So Williams is not going to have a great start. And if you're a Williams fan, don't panic is basically the moral of the story. Now, let's get into our predictions for Australia. As you know, Emily and I, we predict pole, podium, and P10, and we give ourselves points for everything we pick. So you get 1 point for pole, you get 5 points for a correct podium in the correct order, and 3 points for a correct podium of the drivers in an incorrect order, and also 3 points for P10 because P10 is the last scoring spot, and it's also really, really difficult to predict. And now we have 22 drivers instead of 20 drivers, so it's going to be even more complicated because there's so many more people, because there's 2 whole more people. But anyway, going into our predictions, I got predictions from Emily while she was still at work, taking a 5-second break. So thank you for sending those, Emily, and hopefully we will be able to discuss them on Sunday. But going into it, for pole, Emily picked Max Verstappen, and shockingly, I did not. And I know that I'm going to be disappointed in this choice because I have always been disappointed when I have picked this driver, and so has Emily, and I don't know why I'm doing this, is I picked George. So we'll see how that goes. Our podiums are actually pretty similar, which I picked my predictions before Emily sent me hers. So there was no, I picked that and she picked that. And we also always do blind predictions when we do our predictions. So sometimes they're just basically the same by accident, we swear. These were not the same, but they are a little bit similar. So for the podium for Australia, I picked Max, George, Oscar in 1, 2, and 3, and Emily picked Max, Kimi, and George. So we will see how that goes. Going down to P10, which is, of course, the last point scoring place, I picked Gabriel Bortoleto because, like I said, I want to see stronger starts from both debut teams, but I think that if we see a really good start from Cadillac, I think that means that both of the drivers are in the points, which I don't know how many drivers from the debut teams we're going to see in the points. We'll see. And then Emily picked Carlos Sainz, which I think is very optimistic for Williams, but I think is also like that could be the best performance out of Williams that we're going to see. And so we want to be optimistic for Williams because we want to see them do well. Now, for biggest surprise and who is going to do a dumb, Emily did not supply those for us this week, but I picked a couple out for us. And for the biggest surprise, I picked that this race is not a rules-induced shit show, which hopefully it's not, because I think that, you know, one of the best parts about Formula One is the racing, and we don't want the rules and these new regulations to kind of screw with that. And then for the dumb, it's just Aston Martin. And if it's not Aston Martin, it's going to be Ferrari doing something stupid, but mostly it's going to be Aston Martin, unless it's Alpine doing something stupid. You know, Alpine and Ferrari are pretty much like the top two picks of like who's going to do a dumb. So we'll see. And before I get into final thoughts, I do want to break in real quick because I forgot to mention this earlier. We are going to have a different qualifying this year, or slightly different qualifying procedure, because as you remember, last year in qualifying, you had in Q1 you have the bottom 5 drivers who are excluded from Q2, and then you have then you have drivers 11 through 15 who are excluded after the second qualifying. Now, because we have 22 drivers, what we're doing now, tiny difference. They are basically splitting the difference in Q1 and Q2. So Q3 is still going to be the 10 driver, probably 1 to 2 lap shootout. In Q1, they will drop the bottom 6 drivers, and Q2, they're going to drop those bottom 6 drivers. And that brings you to 22 drivers. So that is going to be a little bit different out of qualifying this year, but not completely different. They haven't broken qualifying. It's the same thing. It's just that you get 6 drivers out in Q1 and Q2. Now, moving on to my final thoughts. Like I said, I think that this race is really going to be a write-off, and they're going to treat race 2 as like a mulligan. Like, we're going to pretend this is the first race now. Yes, points will be given out, and these points will be very critical, especially as we go into the Drivers' Championship race. But this is really going to be an information gathering event for a lot of teams, which hopefully means that it still will be an exciting race for the fans. But it also might not be. But like, if this is your first Formula One race, like, if it's bad, I'm sorry, but like, don't worry, just keep watching, it will get better. So those are my final thoughts. I'm very excited to have racing back again and to have this like clean slate that we have of the new regulation where we really don't know anything. Like, the predictions Emily and I have picked are completely out of our backside and not even really based on what we've seen out of the testing sessions, because we know that teams will and will and do sandbag themselves, and we really won't see like the full pace until we get to race day, maybe. But this is going to be another season of like, we're not going to see how the full grid looks for a while. But that means it's going to be really interesting to start off. So I'm really excited for that. So we're going to see. Coming up next, we'll have our Australia reaction episode. It will be out on Monday. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications if you're watching on YouTube so that I can continue to inflict more of my motorsport opinions on the greater population. If you are listening to this on your preferred podcast platform, please leave us a 5-star review so that, like I said, continue, more inflicting of motorsport opinions internationally. That's really, I just want to inflict my thoughts on people. So that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for going off track with us. Enjoy FP1 and FP2 tonight. If you're new to F1, just know that FP1 doesn't matter, and honestly, nor does FP2. It's really, everything that happens tomorrow. But thanks for going off track with us, and we'll see you in the next one.